Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So thank you everybody for taking your evening out to join us for what I hope will be an important and interesting event for you all. I think in many ways this is the start of a discussion about not only what Prevent really is at its roots, but also how we can then, by the end of all the talks, how we can then talk about resisting some of its policies going into the future. But we need to understand first, before anything else about Prevent, the narrative about the problem that we face, because often what happens is that we get, fixated upon small aspects and we forget to look at everything with a big picture in mind. So what is the big picture? The big picture, for me is that, actually, ultimately, the extent of violence that we see in the world today, and let's actually just concentrate within the Western world in terms of political violence, it's very small comparatively, say, for example, to any other form of violence, whether it's rape, different types of sexual assault, murder, knife crime, so on and so forth. Okay, what we see from political violence is relatively small, to the extent that if you look at the works of prominent terrorism experts such as Mark Sageman, who's got a new book out which I very much recommend called Misunderstanding Terrorism, they go through the statistics around this stuff. In his own work, he talks about how actually, if you look at the first 10 years of the war on terror, statistically, the likelihood of there being a terrorist amongst the Muslim population in the West is 1 per million Muslim. Okay, that is what the statistics boil down to, okay, on average, that 1 out of every million Muslims living in the West is a potential terrorist. Okay, sorry, in fact, he says less than 1. Okay, so, you'd have to round up or round down, or either be 0 or 1. We have to accept that there is a threat, okay, because we've seen that threat emerge. But his point, and this is the one that he reiterates and constantly comes back to throughout the whole book, is this: that you cannot have such a climate of fear based around the probability of something that is so small. You cannot put together an entire program and a counterterrorism policy and national, international strategies that target whole communities wholesale when the respective threat is so small. And in his view, based on, once again, his statistics, for every 1 Muslim that they find, they unlawfully either detain, arrest, charge, or abuse in some way 250,000 Muslims in its process. Okay, so this isn't me talking about this. You can read the book for yourself. The statistics are in there. But that is quite a remarkable figure, okay, that some kind of negative action is happening to 250,000 Muslims in the process of finding the one that they're interested in, based on current modalities of counterterrorism policy. So this is important. That's the first point. The second point is, regarding all of these statistics, that when we look at their statistics about what the threat is, they say, well, we've arrested this many people, we've convicted this many people because of terrorist offenses. But okay, let's first ask, well, how many of those terrorist offenses were actually violent offenses? And when you start going through it again, you find that almost 70% of the people convicted of terrorism offenses here in the UK especially are for what they term non-violent offenses. What that means is that there was never any prospect of violence ever conceived in the preparation, act, or commission of the offense. It's to do with things like not answering questions at a port when you're stopped under terrorism powers, which is their Schedule 7. Many of you will be familiar with that, especially those of you who travel. And also things like having, for example, what they would term a terrorism publication. But the thing with these offenses is that they're what we would term strict liability offenses. That means that if I have, say, for example, a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook in my possession, right, especially as a Muslim, and there is a double standard because it depends on who you are, they will come and arrest me and they will say, you have this copy of the Anarchist Cookbook in your possession, this is a terrorist publication, and therefore you have committed an offense. Now, they don't have to prove you committed offense. The burden of proof is reversed. You have to prove in a court of law to a jury why you had a reasonable excuse for having that book in your possession. If you do not have a reasonable excuse, such as, for example, being a journalist or a researcher, you have committed the offense, meaning you can get a prison sentence, and in many cases people do get prison sentences, just by the mere fact you had it in your possession, even if you didn't read it. It's just about having it in your possession. So this is how these terrorism statistics are inflated. Okay, we have to understand that to know where we are right now. Some very, very famous cases, such as Rukhsana Begum's case and many others that I urge you to look into, but due to a lack of time, I want to go through this presentation. So right after 9/11, there was a link that was made, right? And many of you will be familiar with that link because you live that link in your daily lives, that there is a connection between Islam and terrorism, or Islam and political violence, that the two are inextricably linked to one another. They started with this thesis. So what happened is that every single action that states took after that had to fulfill that initial thesis, right? So if you've already come up with your conclusion, then everything you will do from that point onwards will be to do what? Will be to try and fulfill that conclusion. It will be to try and prove that hypothesis, right? And so they instituted a number of different counterterrorism policies and legislations, one per year. There has never been in the history of the UK, or in fact the history of the world, this degree of implementation of national security legislation and policy. Okay, this is a unique point in history that we are going through. And it was to do what? It was to link, this is after, especially in 2005, it was to link the notion of violence to belief. And after 2005, the original PREVENT program, when it was instituted, they said that, we're about trying to prevent violent extremism, right? But even though they said it was about violence, their rhetoric, especially Tony Blair's rhetoric, kept on referring to this arc of extremism, the problem of extremist ideology. He would constantly reference this, setting up the second phase of PREVENT, which happened in 2011, which was to do what? To say, well, actually, we're not just preventing violent extremism, we actually want to prevent extremism itself. And that's when they came up with this really vague definition within the PREVENT strategy of what extremism is, which they define as being against fundamental British values, which is further defined as, kind of the rule of law, equality, not calling for the deaths of the armed services, and so on and so forth. It's a very, very wide and vague term that they use, but it's the term that is used in order to do what? In order to establish a baseline from their perspective of what they can call out to be extremist behavior. And it's so wide that, of course, anything can come under its rubric. What was funny, or not so funny, is that when this strategy first came out and started being pushed, we used to joke in the office about the movie and the book Minority Report. Some of you will be familiar with it, right? In it they talk about pre-crime. So we actually, as a joke, used to say to one another, this is exactly like pre-crime, can you believe it? Because it just had this whole notion of we're trying to prevent future crimes from taking place. And it stopped being funny the moment I sat in a security conference. It was a roundtable discussion where there were securocrats, there were lawyers, there were different people from both sides of the debate. And one of the senior Prevent officials, he said, well, you know, we're not interested in criminalizing people. We're interested in intervening in the pre-crime space. And all the lawyers in the room said, hold on a second, did you actually say pre-crime out loud? And he goes like, yes, very seriously. This is about pre-crime. Like, you realize there's only crime, and then there's nothing before crime. There's just the crime, okay? You have to understand that, right? And he goes, no, no, no. Look, we're trying to intervene pre-criminal, before they go on to become terrorists. Right, so how do you find that out exactly? And that's the whole point, right? They came up with this notion that they can predict future behavior. And inshallah, we're going to go into more of that detail, but I just want to go through some of the history more first. So, you know, as I said, that there's a starting point, right, that they're trying to prevent people falling into terrorism or becoming radicalized. This is notion that there's this linear path towards it. If you are influenced by certain factors, you are on a pathway to becoming a terrorist. I remember Dr. Siddiqui and I sitting with a journalist who kind of showed us some documentation from the government. And he goes, look, I've just been presented this documentation, and they talk about this kind of stratosphere of Muslim organizations in the UK. And he goes, government's view is that any of these groups are 10 days away from carrying out a suicide bombing. Okay, and that included like the Islamic Society of Britain, the Muslim Council of Britain, the Muslim Association of Britain, FOSIS, so on and so forth, right? And it was completely mad. But they had this notion that because of a set of general nebulous beliefs, that any of those people in that stratosphere of belief could, you know, within 10 days, carry out a suicide bombing. So when you have this thinking embedded in your strategy, in your policy, it's going to affect then every single decision you make after that. And that's where Prevent really finds its basis. And so, fast forwarding to 2015, they looked to implement something called the Counterterrorism and Security Act, or at the time it was a bill. And why did they do this? They did this because effectively nobody was playing ball with Prevent. Yes, there were a few community organizations up and down the country that were playing a role, but nobody was really implementing it. Nobody really wanted to. Teachers were against it, doctors were against it. So they had to force the issue. The way that they wanted to force it was by placing it at statutory level. They said, that's it. We're going to force everyone to play a role in relation to stopping this process of radicalization. We campaigned heavily against the bill ourselves, other organizations did as well, but unfortunately the reality is that we weren't able to stop it. It became an act of parliament. But one of the things we were warning about was that this legislation, it's not simply something about soft law, because that's how Prevent is presented. It's presented as this isn't hard law. We're not banging people up here. We're not locking them away. This is all soft law. We just want to have the ability to be able to intervene in people's lives in a more discursive way. It's kind of this whole idea of consent, that it's consent-based. So when we read the legislation, we said this isn't consent-based. This has got coercion built into it almost in every single line. So it says, for example, in the section relating to de-radicalization consent, okay, that when a panel is convened, where there's a threat to a child, so the local council convenes a panel, they can produce a bespoke de-radicalization plan for if he's under 18 or she's under 18, for the child or above, then for the adult. But with the child, they have to get consent from the parents. From the adult, they get consent from the individual. So you think, okay, fine, that's reasonable. You're not forcing anybody to do it. It's consent-based until you read the subclause. So the clause that comes immediately after that is what? Is where consent cannot be obtained, the panel can look at options within the health and social services. So as soon as we read that, we knew one thing. That means that they can go to social services to take your child away if you don't get consent. They can go to the health services and say this person should be sectioned because they're not giving consent. Okay, so coercion is built into the legislation. And when we complained about that publicly, while it was still a bill, we said that, oh, they're scaremongering, they're fearmongering, they're trying to kind of give a bad image to Prevent, whereas Prevent's this lovely, soft, let's give hugs way of stopping people from becoming radicals. And that's key to this, right? Because as soon as you build policy and legislation that intervenes in people's lives without an actual crime having been committed, it opens you up. And going back to this notion of it being soft, yes, it's soft maybe from one perspective, and I'm sure there are some decent Prevent officers out there who take a very common sense approach to this whole thing. But the reality is that when you look at the definition of extremism and then you chart its roots, where does it go? How far does it spread? All of a sudden, when a mother gets a letter through her letterbox saying your son is abroad right now, please inform your son that we deem him to be an Islamist extremist and therefore we have removed his citizenship from him. That is the definition from the Prevent strategy that gave them the ability to remove the citizenship. Or that your son is abroad, tell him that he's not permitted to come back into the country. Or we're informing you that because you're an Islamist extremist, that you are not permitted to leave your house under a TPIM order, or so on and so on and so forth. So the notion that they don't use this legislation, they don't use this, this policy as a weapon against the community is completely false, because they use it all the time. And what's absolutely diabolical about it is that when you go and challenge that in the courts, which they allow you to do, you come before the judge and the judge says, well, you can challenge it, but the government's going to present its evidence in secret because this is a civil law matter, not a criminal matter. And so you're left trying to fight this blind. The government's presenting its evidence in secret. You can't see the evidence against you. Your lawyer can't see the evidence against you. So how do you effectively fight it? And the reality is you can't. And we have people in this room here today who had 2-3 years of their lives ruined because they had to fight a secret court system. You've lost 2 or 3 years of life just like that as soon as the order is made. And it's an arbitrary order. The Home Secretary just signs a paper and you're given it. That's it. So exactly as we predicted with the CTS Act, the cases started flooding in. As soon as it became statutory, it sped up at a rate that has been unprecedented. People, teachers, doctors, making referrals all the time. There are people from Prevent Watch here today, and they will tell you that the cases are just coming in thick and fast of abuse after abuse after abuse of this system. I mean, just look at the T-shirt case. A young boy goes into school wearing the words Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, one of the greatest heroes of Islam, on his back, and he gets reported. Why? Because the teacher thinks he's lauding Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi because of their ignorance. So your bigotry and your Islamophobia result in what? Result in our children feeling scared that they can't go into school. This is the reality of Prevent, that it allows for everyday bigotry to become normalized in what? In order to safeguard. And this is where statistics become important again, because the pro-Prevent lobby will tell you, last year there were 4,000 Prevent referrals to channel, and 4,000 referrals to channel, 2,000 were Muslim, 2,000 were non-Muslim, which shows that it's even-handed, right? That's what they'll say as an evidence for how wonderful they are. And then you remind them, and we must remind them, that's 2,000 Muslim children out of a population of 3 million Muslims. On the other side, it's 2,000 non-Muslims out of a population of 57 million non-Muslims. Okay? So now you do the maths. It tells you what? That a Muslim child in the UK right now is 20 times more likely to be referred to channel than a non-Muslim child. That is discriminatory. That shows you what? That a suspect community has been created. And so I only have a few minutes left, so I want to get on to the main purpose of this talk, which is to talk about our latest report. Because why is all of this important? Why do we need to understand what the roots are of all of this? Because if we don't understand where this comes from, we won't be able to effectively challenge it. So what Cage did is we asked ourselves the question, well, the government says it knows how radicalization works. Well, how does it know how radicalization works? That's the question you want to ask yourself. Well, you say you know. Where is the empirical evidence? Where are the studies? Where are the reports? And as soon as we asked, they said, well, it's a matter of national security. We can't give it to you. So you've built this entire superstructure of national security. You're telling us you know how people become terrorists, and yet you won't share it with us. Fortunately, the authors of the two psychologists who wrote the government's study about how the factors of radicalization work and go on, in their view, to produce these terrorists, was published in a very niche journal in America. Like, nobody would ever find this thing unless you were looking for it. Fortunately, we were looking for it. So we found this and we scrutinized it. And we didn't just leave it to ourselves. We said, okay, fine, we know we're against prevent. Let's give it to 3 different psychologists. So we asked them, you guys take a look, tell us what you think. And we gave it to 17 other academics who are experts in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism. We asked them to look at it too. And all of them came back and said the same thing. This is an utter scandal. 140 senior academics signed a joint letter saying that the science of this radicalization process is a complete scandal. And why is it a scandal? Because the authors of the study themselves say you cannot use these factors of radicalization to predict future behavior. This is key. The government has based its entire strategy around the notion that it can predict future behavior, that there is this concept of pre-criminalization, but yet the authors of the study that they produced themselves in their own words, and you can read our report, you can get copies at the back, says that you cannot predict future behavior. So the government's based theory is entirely false. And when we published our report, The Guardian wrote an article about it, and Ben Wallace, the security minister, he responded to it and said, well, actually, this has been academically peer reviewed. The scientific community has said this is absolutely fine. It's been reviewed in 2 academic journals. So, it's got credibility. So what did we do? Well, the first journal was the one in America, which we already critiqued, and we showed that it was completely bogus. But we didn't know about the other one. It was in the British Psychological Society. So we rang them up, and we said, sorry, we just wanted to find out about your, kind of peer review of this study, to just see what kind of processes you went through. They said, we're not a journal. We're a magazine. We accept anything under 1,500 words as long as it's interesting, And so, a senior minister coming out publicly and talking about the academic credibility of a government study who hasn't even bothered to understand that there is no academic cover for this thing. They built policy around this. And how do we know they built policy around it? Because when they came out and some of the prevent officials started coming out and saying, well, actually, it's not for prevent, it's for channel only, then the lies start coming out. Because if you say, well, actually, we know it's part of channel because the channel document says, the de-radicalization document says this is based on this psychological framework. And then when we go through your prevent training policies, they all say, this is based on that same study. So there's this constant deception that has taken place by prevent, where the science, this bogus science, is being used to give credibility to something that has none. It's our responsibility to challenge that and say you cannot base your strategy around this. And just to make a couple of concluding remarks, why is this all important? Because right now, as our next report, which will be inshallah released within the next month, will show, there are children being taken away from their families on the basis of this study. The defense and the prosecution teams are given a document that says, this is based on this thing called the Extremism Risk Guidance 22+, this psychology study. It's a working hypothesis, but we're still going to use it anyway. So right now, almost 40 cases of Muslim children being taken away from their families, and in what system? In that same secret court system. So we have to challenge this, because based on a false science, based on a false notion of the way that radicalization works, we are being harmed. Our community is being harmed systematically. And where does this all fit? It fits in with the notion of structural racism. Okay, we are being built into this suspect community based on false statistics, based on a false analysis, based on a false notion of history, okay, and of our community. And until we challenge them by saying that your statistics are wrong, your theories are wrong, your science is wrong, we will never be able to effectively challenge them. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.